The training dummy lay crumpled on the kitchen table, its synthetic flesh torn where Lily's small fingers had worked the suture needle through simulated tissue. Morning light filtered through the cabin windows, catching dust motes that danced like snow before the storm. Daniel Harris watched his daughter's hands move with precision that would have seemed impossible in a child barely 7 3/4 years old, her tongue pressed against her upper lip in concentration. The needle slipped again, thread pulling too tight, puckering the rubber skin. Lily's shoulders sagged. Daniel's hand covered hers, warm and steady. What did we learn about tension? Her voice came small but determined. Even stitches, Daddy. Not too loose or the wound opens. Not too tight or the tissue tears. Show me. She took a breath that seemed too large for her small frame, reset the needle, began again. This time the thread moved through, cleanly, each stitch a mirror of the last. When she tied off the final knot, something fierce and painful swelled in Daniel's chest. Maria had possessed that same stubborn excellence, that refusal to accept anything less than mastery. Outside, November, cold pressed against Colorado's San Juan Mountains with the patient weight of glaciers. The thermometer mounted beside the door read 18 degrees, and the sky held that peculiar quality of gray that promised snow before nightfall. Daniel had learned to read these mountains the way soldiers read terrain, understanding that weather here could shift from inconvenient to lethal within the span of a heartbeat. The cabin stood at the end of 17 miles of dirt road that wound through pine forest so dense that satellite signals struggled to penetrate. Most delivery drivers refused the route even in summer. In winter, only the most desperate or foolish attempted it. Daniel preferred it that way. Isolation served as both medicine and fortress, keeping the world's complications at a distance his daughter didn't yet need to navigate. Ranger lifted his head from his position beside the wood stove, ears swiveling towards sounds only he could detect. The German shepherd's body carried scars from 2 tours in Afghanistan, visible marks from a war that had left deeper wounds in the places no one could see. His eyes tracked Lily with an intensity that bordered on obsession, a guardian angel rendered in fur and muscle, and barely contained ferocity. Daniel knew that look. He saw it in his own mirror each morning, that hypervigilance that never quite faded, that made peaceful moments feel like temporary ceasefires rather than lasting peace. Lily held up the training dummy, its wound now closed, with neat precision. Can I practice on something harder tomorrow? Maybe the advanced trauma kit? Tomorrow we review compound fractures. Then we'll see about upgrading your equipment. She bounced on her toes, that particular dance of excitement that reminded Daniel so much of Maria that sometimes he had to look away. His wife had moved through the world with that same restless energy, as if stillness meant missing something vital. Even at the end, when cancer had stolen almost everything she'd maintained, that spark of constant motion. The clock above the sink read 6:47. Their day had begun at 5:30 with physical training, a holdover from Daniel's military years, that he'd adapted into age-appropriate exercises. Lily could do 30 push-ups, run 2 miles without stopping, and climb a rope using only her arms. These weren't the skills of a typical second grader, but typical second graders didn't live 17 miles from civilization with only their fathers and a war veteran dog for company. Daniel moved to the kitchen counter where breakfast waited: oatmeal with wild blueberries they'd harvested and frozen last summer, honey from the neighbor who kept bees 12 miles south. Simple food but nourishing. He'd learned to cook after Maria died, teaching himself through necessity and YouTube videos watched on nights when sleep proved impossible. Lily climbed onto her chair legs, swinging beneath the table. Ranger immediately positioned himself beside her, close enough that she could reach down and bury her fingers in his fur. The dog's presence seemed to anchor her, providing a steadiness that Daniel envied. The homeschooling curriculum lay spread across the far end of the table, a mix of traditional subjects and survival education that no accredited institution would approve. Lily could recite the periodic table and identify edible plants. She understood fractions through measuring ingredients and learned geography by studying topographic maps of their mountain range. Maria had believed in unconventional wisdom in learning that served life rather than test scores. Daniel had promised to honor that belief even when it meant swimming against every current of social expectation. Steam rose from their bowls, carrying the scent of cinnamon and wild berries. Outside, the first snowflakes began to fall, small and tentative, scouts for the army that would follow. Daniel noted their arrival with the automatic assessment of someone who understood that weather in these mountains demanded respect. The forecast called for 6 to 8 inches by midnight, nothing particularly unusual for late November, but enough to make the road treacherous for anyone unfamiliar with its switchbacks and blind curves. Lily ate methodically, another trait inherited from her mother. Maria had approached everything with that same careful deliberation, measuring twice and cutting once, planning 3 steps ahead, while Daniel operated on instinct and reflexes. They'd balanced each other in ways he only fully appreciated after she was gone. The oatmeal tasted of summer memories of days spent hiking through mountain meadows, while Lily collected berries in a bucket shaped like a bear. She'd been 5, then still young enough to believe that happiness was a permanent state rather than a fleeting visitor. 2 years might not seem like much in the grand sweep of time, but in childhood they represented entire epochs of growth and understanding. She'd begun asking harder questions about Maria recently. Not the simple inquiries of a toddler seeking comfort, but genuine attempts to understand mortality and loss and permanence. Daniel answered as honestly as he could, explaining that death meant forever without sugarcoating it into something more palatable. Maria would have wanted their daughter to understand reality, even when reality cut deep. Ranger's ears pricked forward again, his body tensing in that way that meant he'd detected something beyond normal range. Daniel's hand moved unconsciously toward the spot where his sidearm would have rested during his service years. Old habits persisted, even in civilian life muscle memory, that refused to forget. But the dog relaxed after a moment, settling back into watchful calm, probably a deer moving through the forest, or an elk browsing winter deadfall. The mountains teemed with life that most people never saw, hidden creatures that knew these woods far better than any human. After breakfast, they moved into the day's lessons. Mathematics came first, word problems that Daniel crafted around practical scenarios. If you're hiking and need to ration food for 3 days and you have 6 energy bars plus 4 apples, how much can you eat each day? Lily worked the problem on paper, showing her calculations with careful precision. The lesson expanded into discussions of caloric needs and metabolic rates, information that seemed dry until contextualized against survival situations. Daniel had learned in the Army that abstract knowledge meant little. Give people a reason to care about information, and suddenly it became memorable, essential, tattooed into consciousness through relevance. Science followed mathematics, a dissection of how internal combustion engines worked. They had a lawnmower engine stripped down on a tarp in the corner, each component labeled and cataloged. Lily could identify pistons and valves, understood compression and ignition. The lesson wasn't about teaching a 7-year-old to rebuild engines, but about demonstrating that mechanical things followed logical principles, that the world operated according to rules that could be learned and mastered. Maria had believed that knowledge built confidence, and confidence built courage. A child who understood how things worked wouldn't panic when faced with problems. A girl who could take apart an engine wouldn't feel helpless when confronted with life's inevitable breakdowns. Around 10:30, they broke for physical education. This meant snowshoeing through the forest on trails Daniel had marked years ago, paths that wound through pine groves and across frozen streams. Lily moved with practiced efficiency, her small body adapted to the rhythm of winter travel. Ranger ranged ahead, clearing trail, his military training evident in how he scouted and reported back through body language Daniel could read like text. The forest held that peculiar silence of snowfall sound, dampened by white curtains that grew thicker with each passing hour. The flakes had graduated from tentative to committed fat crystals that accumulated on pine branches and caught in Lily's hair. She tilted her face skyward, catching snow on her tongue, and for a moment she was just a child experiencing wonder rather than a student absorbing survival skills. Daniel let her have that moment. Childhood should contain some magic, even childhood shaped by loss and isolation. Maria would have approved of that balance of teaching strength without crushing joy. They stopped beside a frozen pond where Lily practiced ice assessment, learning to read thickness through observation and careful testing. Too many people drowned each winter by trusting ice that appeared solid but concealed fatal weakness. The lesson was literal and metaphorical, teaching her that surfaces often lied, that true safety required looking deeper. By noon, they'd covered 3 miles, returning to the cabin with cheeks flushed from cold and exertion. Lunch consisted of venison chili Daniel had prepared yesterday, meat from a buck he'd harvested, and October vegetables they'd grown in their summer garden. Self-sufficiency wasn't about paranoia or conspiracy theories, but about understanding that remote living demanded different skills than urban convenience. After lunch came reading time, and this was where Lily most reminded Daniel of Maria. His wife had devoured books with hungry intensity, believing that stories built empathy and expanded internal worlds beyond physical constraints. Lily inherited that same appetite. Today she'd chosen a novel about a girl solving mysteries in a coastal town, reading aloud passages that captured her interest, while Ranger snoozed beside her chair. Daniel worked on his laptop at the kitchen table, writing technical descriptions for camping equipment catalogs. His military background lent authenticity to the work, allowing him to explain gear in terms that serious outdoorsmen appreciated. The pay covered their modest needs, and the flexible schedule meant he never had to leave Lily with strangers. The afternoon lessons shifted to history, but not the sanitized version taught in standard curricula. Daniel believed in teaching complete truths, including uncomfortable ones. They discussed westward expansion through multiple perspectives, examining how the same events looked different depending on whether you stood on a wagon train or watched your homeland disappear beneath foreign boots. Lily grasped moral complexity with frightening ease. She understood that people could be simultaneously brave and cruel, that history was written by survivors rather than truth-tellers, that justice and law didn't always align. These were heavy concepts for someone so young, but Daniel had learned that children possess remarkable capacity for nuance if adults trusted them with honesty. Around 3 o'clock, Ranger began exhibiting subtle signs of agitation. Nothing dramatic, just a slight tension in his shoulders, an increase in how often his head turned toward the windows. Daniel noticed immediately his own awareness sharpening in response. The snowfall had intensified visibility, reduced to perhaps 50 yards. Wind had picked up, driving flakes horizontal across the clearing around their cabin. This was typical mountain weather, dramatic, but manageable for those prepared. The generator had full tanks. They had food for months, firewood stacked under cover. Let the storm rage. They'd weathered worse. But Ranger's unease suggested something beyond weather concerns. The dog had instincts honed by situations where overlooked details meant death. Daniel trusted those instincts more than his own sometimes. He moved to the window, scanning the tree line. Nothing visible through the white chaos, but that meant little. The forest could hide multitudes when it chose. Lily appeared beside him, her small hand finding his. "Is something wrong, Daddy?" He chose honesty over comfortable lies. "Ranger senses something. Probably just wildlife moving ahead of the storm. But we'll keep alert, okay?" She nodded solemnly, accepting his words without panic. This was the benefit of steady preparation, of treating danger as something to respect rather than fear. Lily had grown up understanding that the world contained threats, but also that knowledge and readiness provided protection. The afternoon continued with art education watercolors that Lily used to paint the storm outside their window. Her style showed remarkable observation, capturing not just shapes, but the quality of light filtering through snow-laden air. Maria had possessed similar artistic ability, though she channeled it into photography rather than painting. Daniel kept their old photo albums in a trunk in his bedroom, pulled them out on nights when memory felt more comforting than painful. Images of Maria laughing at their wedding, her belly swollen with pregnancy, holding infant Lily with fierce tenderness. The photographs helped Lily remember her mother gave substance to stories that otherwise might have felt like fairy tales. Around 5 o'clock, Daniel began preparing dinner. Tonight meant roasted chicken with root vegetables, simple fare elevated by hunger, and the satisfaction of having produced much of the meal through their own labor. The potatoes came from their garden, the carrots likewise. The chicken came from the neighbor with the bees, a woman in her 70s who maintained a small farm and appreciated having reliable customers. Lily set the table with careful precision, placing utensils exactly perpendicular to plate edges. She'd developed small rituals like this, ways of imposing order on a world that had proven chaotic enough to steal mothers from daughters. Daniel never discouraged these habits. If arranging silverware provided comfort, then let comfort come from whatever source it found. They ate dinner while snow accumulated outside the world, gradually erasing itself beneath white blankets. Daniel found himself thinking about tomorrow's supply run into Cedar Falls, a trip he made monthly for items they couldn't produce or procure locally. The forecast suggested the storm would clear by morning, leaving roads passable by afternoon. Cedar Falls represented civilization's closest approach to their mountain sanctuary. A town of perhaps 8,000, it served as the commercial hub for scattered mountain communities. Daniel made his visits brief and efficient, gathering supplies and departing before small-town curiosity could ask too many questions about the widower and his homeschooled daughter living like modern hermits 17 miles up a logging road. After dinner, Lily took her bath while Daniel cleaned the kitchen and checked weather reports on his laptop. The storm had strengthened, upgraded to a winter weather warning, with predictions now calling for 12 to 16 inches. More than expected, but still within manageable parameters. He moved through the cabin, conducting evening checks, a routine as ingrained as breathing. Windows latched doors secured generator functioning properly, backup batteries charged, emergency supplies accessible. These rituals provided structure and safety, twin needs that had become even more critical after Maria's death. Ranger accompanied him on the rounds, the dog's presence, a warm solidity in the growing darkness. They'd bonded immediately when Jim Rodriguez had driven 14 hours to deliver the German Shepherd, two damaged veterans recognizing kinship without words. Ranger had completed his service and earned rest. Daniel had left his service behind, but never quite achieved rest. Together, they'd found something approaching peace. Lily emerged from her bath in purple pajamas printed with constellations, her wet hair dampening her shoulders. She carried the stuffed rabbit that had been her constant companion since Maria's diagnosis, a gift from her mother during those final terrible weeks. The rabbit showed its age, fur matted from countless embraces, one ear repaired with careful stitches. Daniel read to her from their current chapter book, a fantasy about children discovering magic in ordinary places. Maria had believed in reading aloud long past the age when most parents stopped arguing that shared stories built bonds deeper than practical education. These evening readings had become sacred time, 30 minutes when Daniel could set aside the weight of single parenthood and simply enjoy his daughter's presence. When sleep finally claimed Lily, Daniel remained beside her bed, watching her breathe, counting each rise and fall of her small chest. Parenthood had always carried elements of terror, awareness that love created vulnerability, that investing everything in another person meant accepting the possibility of devastating loss. But after Maria, that terror had intensified into something almost paralyzing. Every moment with Lily felt precious and fragile, as if the universe might notice his happiness and decide to balance the scales by taking her too. Irrational thinking, but grief rewired neural pathways in ways that logic couldn't quite override. Ranger had positioned himself across Lily's doorway, as he did every night, and assuming his guardian post with military discipline. The dog would remain there until morning, alert to threats real and imagined. Daniel drew comfort from that vigilance, knowing his daughter had two protectors rather than one. He retreated to the living room where his own laptop waited emails from clients and forums where technical writers shared job leads. Work could have waited until tomorrow, but Daniel found himself restless despite exhaustion, mind churning through concerns he couldn't quite name. The snow continued falling, accumulation already impressive. 8 inches at least, maybe more. The kind of snowfall that transformed the landscape into something alien and beautiful, burying familiar landmarks beneath white uniformity. Outside, wind howled through pine trees, a sound that alternated between soothing and unsettling. Daniel had grown accustomed to mountain music, the thousand small sounds that comprise wilderness symphony. But tonight, something felt different, a note of discord threading through familiar patterns. He checked the weather radar again, watching the storm system's progress. The main band would continue through midnight before tapering toward morning. By dawn, the worst would have passed, leaving behind the hard work of digging out and assessing damage. The clock read 9:15. Early by most standards, but mountain living encouraged schedules aligned with sunlight rather than electricity. Daniel allowed himself one beer, a local IPA purchased during last month's supply run, drinking it slowly while watching snow accumulate beyond the window. His phone showed no signal, unsurprising given the weather. They had a satellite internet connection for work and emergencies, but cellular service had always been unreliable this far into the mountains. Most days that isolation felt like blessing rather than handicap. He thought about Maria as he did every night before sleep. 6 years had passed, enough time that the initial agony had mellowed into dull ache, but grief never disappeared completely. It simply changed shape, learned to coexist with joy and routine and forward motion. She would have loved seeing Lily today, watching their daughter master suturing with determined precision. Maria had possessed such faith in human potential, believing that people could learn anything if given proper instruction and motivation. Their parenting philosophy had been built on that foundation, trusting Lily with real skills and honest information. Sometimes Daniel wondered if he pushed too hard, expected too much, prepared their daughter for worst-case scenarios that might never materialize. But then he remembered the randomness of cancer, the way Maria had gone from healthy to terminal in 18 months, and he understood that preparing for the worst wasn't paranoia but realism. The world contained threats both obvious and hidden. Preparing Lily to face them wasn't cruelty, but the deepest expression of love he could offer. Around 10 o'clock, Daniel conducted final checks before bed. He added wood to the stove, adjusted dampers, confirmed that backup systems stood ready. Outside, snow had accumulated to perhaps 10 inches, drifts piling higher, where wind gathered and deposited white cargo. Tomorrow would mean hours of shoveling clearing paths to the generator shed and wood storage, ensuring the road remained passable for when he needed to reach town. Physical labor but satisfying, the kind of work that produced visible results and genuine exhaustion. He climbed the stairs to his bedroom, a simple space with minimal furnishing. The bed he'd shared with Maria, though he'd replaced the mattress after her death, unable to sleep, where she'd spent those final pain-filled months. Her clothes still hung in the closet, a shrine he couldn't quite bring himself to dismantle. Lily sometimes went in there burying her face in fabric that had lost Maria's scent years ago, but retained some ineffable quality of connection. Sleep came slowly, as it often did. Daniel's mind refused to quiet, completely running through preparations and contingencies, mental lists of tasks requiring attention. The hypervigilance that had served him well in combat became counterproductive in civilian life, but he'd never learned to disable it. Somewhere around 11, exhaustion finally overrode anxiety, pulling him under into restless dreams where Maria walked through snow that never quite touched the ground. 60 miles away in Cedar Falls, Officer Kate Miller sat in her Honda Civic parked in shadows across from the Cedar Falls Police Department headquarters. The dashboard clock read 11:43. Sodium vapor lights cast the station in sickly orange glow, painting familiar architecture in colors that felt appropriate for what she'd learned about the building's true nature. 3 months of investigation had led to this moment. 3 months of careful documentation, hidden recordings, photographed evidence, collected during hours when she should have been sleeping. The USB drive in her jacket pocket contained enough proof to dismantle careers, trigger federal prosecutions, send her fellow officers to federal prison. The weight of it felt both insignificant and crushing. Kate had grown up believing police work meant protecting people, serving communities, standing between cow and civilization. Her father had modeled that ideal through decades, running Miller's Hardware, extending credit to struggling families, organizing fundraisers for medical bills, embodying the kind of community spirit she'd thought the badge represented. She'd been wrong. The corruption had revealed itself gradually, each new layer appearing only after she'd processed the previous shock. First came small things: officers pocketing cash during drug busts, evidence disappearing from lockup. When she'd reported these incidents to her sergeant, he'd explained that sometimes rules bent to serve larger purposes, that maintaining order required flexibility. When she'd pressed harder, her patrol assignments had shifted to Riverside, Cedar Falls' most dangerous neighborhood, where backup arrived slowly, if at all. The message was clear, even if unspoken directly: stay quiet or stay vulnerable. But Kate possessed her father's stubbornness wrapped in her mother's strategic intelligence. If the system was corrupted from within, she'd document everything until the weight of evidence became undeniable. So she'd begun collecting proof. It started with her personal phone recording conversations that revealed too much about sources and methods, then graduated to a dedicated device purchased with cash, no connection to her identity. She'd photographed documents after hours, copied files when the station emptied, built a case with the patience of someone constructing cathedrals from individual stones. The USB drive now held recordings of at least 15 officers discussing drug distribution, weapon sales, evidence, tampering. Financial records showing hundreds of thousands in unexplained income. Text messages coordinating illegal activities. A network that reached from street-level cops to Chief Morrison himself, maybe higher. Kate had made contact with FBI agent Sarah Chen 3 weeks ago, arranging a meeting for tomorrow morning at a coffee shop in Denver. The plan was simple: deliver evidence, cooperate fully, accept protective custody if necessary, burn down the corrupt infrastructure, and hope something better could be built from ashes. But watching the station, now seeing colleagues she'd worked beside for 3 years moving through their shifts, Kate felt the weight of betrayal cutting both ways. Some of these officers had families, kids in Little League mortgages and car payments and normal lives that would shatter when prosecutions came. Yet she'd also seen what their corruption enabled. Drugs back on streets, poisoning communities already struggling with addiction. Weapons sold to criminals who use them in violent crimes. Cases falling apart because evidence disappeared, guilty people walking free while victims lost faith in justice. The moral mathematics weren't complicated, even if they felt heavy. Movement near the station entrance caught her attention. Lieutenant Morrison exiting, accompanied by Sergeant Williams and Detective Evans. They stood in the parking lot for several minutes, their breath forming clouds in cold air, conversation too distant for Kate to hear, but body language suggesting disagreement. Mark Evans broke away first, walking toward his personal vehicle, a restored Mustang he maintained with obsessive care. Kate had worked with Evans on several cases, found him professional and competent. Learning he was part of the corruption had hit particularly hard. Evans seemed like someone who should have known better, who should have stood up rather than sold out. But Kate had learned that corruption rarely announced itself with obvious villains. More often it appeared in gradual compromises, small choices that seemed reasonable until you looked back and couldn't identify where acceptable had become criminal. The parking lot cleared, Morrison and Williams departing in separate vehicles. Kate waited 20 more minutes, confirming the pattern she'd observed over previous nights. Between midnight and 6 a.m., the station operated with minimal staff, 2 officers covering the entire building, security systems running on automated protocols. This created a window. Kate's plan was risky but necessary. She needed one more piece of evidence: the financial ledgers Morrison kept in his office. She'd glimpsed them during a meeting 2 months ago, bound notebooks that contained the kind of detailed record-keeping that proved the operation's scope and organization. Physical ledgers seemed antiquated in a digital age, but that was precisely why Morrison used them. No electronic trail, no cloud backup, no way to access them remotely. Just handwritten entries that existed only as ink on paper, secured in a locked filing cabinet in the chief's office. Kate had acquired a key 3 weeks ago, lifted from the maintenance supervisor's ring during a moment of distraction. She'd made an impression in modeling. Clay had a duplicate cut at a hardware store 2 towns away. The key now rested in her pocket alongside the USB drive, 2 pieces of metal that represented either salvation or destruction, depending on how the next hours unfolded. She checked her service weapon, a Glock 19 she'd qualified with quarterly, but hoped never to use. Checked her backup piece, a snub nose, 38 worn in an ankle holster. Checked the small digital camera she'd used to photograph the ledgers, since removing them would make Morrison aware of the theft immediately. Everything ready, nothing left but execution and consequences. Kate started her engine, letting the Civic warm while she ran through the plan one final time. Enter through the south door using her access card. Navigate to Morrison's office, avoiding security cameras she'd mapped over previous weeks. Photograph the ledgers, 20 minutes maximum. Exit the same way she'd entered. Drive to her apartment, sleep a few hours, meet Agent Chen in Denver at 9 a.m. Simple steps that could go catastrophically wrong in countless ways. But doing nothing meant complicity. Standing by while corruption flourished meant choosing comfort over justice. Kate's parents had taught her that character revealed itself in difficult choices, that courage meant acting despite fear rather than in its absence. She put the Civic in gear, pulling from shadows into streetlight. The drive to the station took 3 minutes. She parked in the public lot rather than the employee area, maintaining the appearance of civilian business rather than officer access. The snow that had been falling in the mountains hadn't reached Cedar Falls yet, but weather forecasts predicted it would arrive within hours. Kate hoped to be long gone before then, safe in Denver, with evidence delivered and protection arranged. The south entrance was locked, requiring card access. Kate swiped her badge through the reader, heard the familiar click of electromagnetic bolts releasing. The door swung open on hinges that needed oiling, a small screech in the quiet night. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed with that particular frequency that made everything feel slightly unreal. The corridor stretched, empty institutional green walls decorated with mandatory safety posters and union notices. Kate moved with practiced confidence, looking like she belonged because technically she did. The security cameras posed the biggest risk. She'd studied their coverage patterns, identified blind spots, but gaps remained where crossing between safe zones required exposure. Nothing to be done about that except move quickly and trust that late-night monitoring was as lax as she suspected. Morrison's office occupied the second floor positioned at the building's northwest corner, with windows overlooking the parking lot. Kate took the stairs rather than the elevator boots echoing on concrete despite her attempts at stealth. The second floor corridor was darker, only emergency lighting activated. Budget constraints meant the department didn't waste electricity illuminating spaces unused during graveyard shift. Kate navigated by memory and thin light from exit signs, reaching Morrison's door without encountering anyone. The door was locked, but she'd expected that. Her regular key opened it smoothly, tumbler clicking with satisfying precision. She slipped inside, closing the door behind her, standing in darkness while her eyes adjusted. Morrison's office smelled of old coffee and cheaper cologne scents that triggered association with countless briefings and performance reviews. The space reflected his personality, military precise organization masking corruption beneath surface order. Citations on the wall awards earned through years of service photographs with local politicians. All the trappings of a decorated career built on betraying everything the badge supposedly represented. Kate crossed to the filing cabinet, testing drawers until she found the one that resisted. The duplicate key worked, though it required jiggling that made her nervous. The drawer slid open with metallic whisper, revealing exactly what she'd come for. 4 ledgers each covering roughly 3 months of operation. The most recent sat on top its pages, filled with Morrison's neat handwriting. Kate pulled out her camera, began photographing pages, working methodically despite adrenaline urging speed. Each spread contained entries, logging transactions, amounts, participants, drugs moving through evidence, lockup weapons, sold through back channels, bribes paid to officials outside the department. Morrison had documented everything with the confidence of someone who believed he'd never be caught. That arrogance would be his downfall. Kate was halfway through the second ledger when she heard voices in the corridor outside. She froze camera halfway to the next page, every muscle locked in sudden panic. The voices grew closer, 2 people engaged in casual conversation about some recent football game. They passed Morrison's office without pausing, continuing down the corridor toward the break room. Kate waited, counting heartbeats, confirming they weren't returning. The silence stretched, broken only by her own breathing and the building's ambient sounds. She forced herself to continue photographing remaining pages with hands that trembled slightly. This evidence would prove the corruption's scope beyond any reasonable doubt, would provide prosecutors with roadmap to dozens of indictments. The final page captured Kate, replaced the ledgers exactly as she'd found them, closed the filing cabinet, locked it with both keys. She'd leave no trace of her visit, nothing to alert Morrison that his secrets had been compromised. The return journey through empty corridors felt longer than the entrance, each shadow potentially concealing threats. But she reached the south door without incident, slipped outside into cold November air that tasted like freedom. In her car, Kate allowed herself one moment of relief before professionalism reasserted control. She had the evidence. Tomorrow she'd deliver it to Agent Chen. By tomorrow afternoon, the machinery of federal investigation would begin grinding through Cedar Falls Police Department, exposing corruption and demanding accountability. She started the Civic, noting the time. 12:47 a.m. Plenty of time to reach her apartment, get a few hours sleep, make the drive to Denver. Everything was proceeding according to plan. The drive home took her along Highway 50, the mountain road that connected Cedar Falls to scattered communities at higher elevations. Traffic was minimal this late, just occasional semi-trucks hauling goods through the night. Kate drove with careful attention, aware that exhaustion and adrenaline made for a dangerous combination. Snow began falling around the 15-mile marker, light flurries that danced in her headlights. Weather moving faster than predicted, but that happened in the mountains. Systems developed their own momentum, arriving early or late, according to atmospheric whims, rather than forecaster calculations. The flurries thickened into steady snowfall. Kate adjusted her speed accordingly, knowing Highway 50's reputation for winter accidents. The road wound through terrain that dropped sharply away on one side, rose steeply on the other. Beautiful during daylight, treacherous in storms. She was focused on driving, watching for black ice and unexpected curves, which was why she didn't notice the vehicle approaching from behind until headlights filled her rearview mirror. High beams closer than proper following distance, matching her speed as she tried to accelerate away. Kate's stomach dropped as recognition crystallized. The headlight pattern belonged to a Crown Victoria, the model Cedar Falls PD, used for unmarked vehicles. Someone had followed her from the station, waited for isolated road, chosen this moment to act. They rammed her from behind before she could formulate response. Impact jolted through the Civic's frame, sending her lurching forward, hands gripping the wheel with desperate strength. She fought to maintain control, but physics overwhelmed intention. The second impact was harder calculated, driving her vehicle toward the shoulder, where gravity and terrain waited to finish what human malice had started. The Civic left the road airborne for a moment that stretched beyond normal time before crashing into the snowbank with violence that deployed airbags and shattered safety glass. The world became chaos of white powder and twisted metal impact, throwing Kate against restraints that held but couldn't prevent her head from striking the side window. Consciousness flickered, dulled by trauma and shock. She was aware of the vehicle's unnatural angle, buried nose first in accumulated snow, aware of footsteps approaching, crunching through powder. Aware that the driver's door was being pulled open, cold air rushing in, hands grabbing her. They dragged her from the wreckage with rough efficiency. Kate tried to fight, but her body wouldn't respond correctly, limbs moving slowly as if underwater. Her service weapon was removed from its holster, her backup piece from its ankle carry. They took her badge, her wallet, her phone. Someone found the USB drive in her jacket pocket, held it up for inspection. Even through the fog of concussion, Kate understood that discovery meant death. They'd come for evidence, would eliminate the witness who'd collected it. Pain exploded in her side, sharp and focused so intense it pierced the cushioning numbness. Kate looked down, saw the knife sliding free from between her ribs, saw blood spreading across her uniform. The wound was precise, calculated to miss vital organs, while ensuring enough damage to make survival unlikely without immediate medical intervention. They'd made it look like injury from the crash trauma that could be explained by the accident's violence. Her death would appear tragic but not suspicious, just another victim of winter roads and driver error. The footsteps retreated, crunching back through snow toward their vehicle. Engines started, headlights swept across the crash site once more before departing, leaving Kate alone in the dark with the storm intensifying around her. She lay against the snowbank, feeling warmth drain from her body along with blood. The USB drive was gone. The evidence she'd risked everything to collect was now in the hands of people who'd kill to keep it hidden. Agent Chen would arrive at tomorrow's meeting to find empty chair, would never know why Kate failed to appear. Everything had been for nothing. Kate tried to move, but agony stopped her. The knife had done its work efficiently, creating damage that required surgery and blood transfusions, neither of which were available on a deserted mountain highway during a snowstorm. She would bleed out here, become another statistic, another cautionary tale about driving too fast in bad weather. Her fingers found her service weapon's empty holster, muscle memory reaching for comfort. That was gone. Everything was gone. The evidence, her chance at justice, probably her life. Cold was setting in, that dangerous numbness that preceded hypothermia. Kate knew the signs, had completed training about wilderness, survival, and winter hazards. She understood she was dying, that rescue would arrive too late, even if rescue was coming at all. She thought about her parents, about how her father would learn about her death through official channels that would lie about circumstances. Her mother would cry and believe the lies because the alternative meant accepting that corruption had killed her daughter. Maybe that was a mercy, letting them remember her as victim of accident rather than murder. Headlights appeared in the distance, approaching from the direction of Cedar Falls. Kate tried to lift herself to wave for help, but her body refused to cooperate. The vehicle would pass by without seeing her, would assume the crashed Civic was already being handled through official channels. But the vehicle slowed, stopped. A pickup truck, old but well-maintained, the kind mountain residents drove because four-wheel drive and ground clearance mattered more than aesthetics. A man emerged, tall and solid, moving with the economy of motion that suggested military training. He approached the crash site with caution, checking angles, assessing threats. When his flashlight beam found Kate, something changed in his posture, wariness shifting to concern. He knelt beside her, his face still hidden by shadows and falling snow. Kate tried to speak, to warn him that helping her meant danger, but words wouldn't form correctly. Her hand found his wrist, gripping with desperate strength. The words finally came, emerging as barely audible whisper, "Please, don't call it in. They'll kill us both if you call it in." His eyes widened slightly, understanding dawning. Behind him, a German shepherd appeared, growling low and continuous, ears flat against his skull. The dog sensed something wrong, some threat lingering in the air beyond what obvious circumstances suggested. Kate forced her other hand toward her jacket pocket, toward where the USB drive should have been, where only emptiness remained. But she had to make him understand, had to communicate the importance, even if the evidence was gone. The man's hands moved over her body with practiced efficiency, finding the wound in her side, applying pressure that sent fresh waves of agony through her nervous system. His face showed decision, forming calculations running behind eyes that had clearly seen violence before. A low voice carried across the snow, barely audible above the wind. Ranger Guard. The German Shepherd moved to position between them and the road, a living barrier against threats that might return. The man lifted Kate with surprising gentleness, her weight apparently negligible, despite her own perception of density and mass. She found herself in the truck's warm cab, the dog immediately positioning itself beside her, offering body heat and steady presence. The man was in the driver's seat now, starting the engine, beginning to drive away from the crash site with deliberate speed. Kate tried to explain or provide information about the corruption and the evidence and the danger, but consciousness kept slipping away like water through cupped hands. She was aware of the truck's motion of pain that grew worse with each bump in the road, of the buoy pressing against her side with warm solidity. And she was aware of one more thing, a detail that cut through the fog of trauma with crystal clarity. The man driving had checked her wounds with military precision, had lifted her with strength that came from experience. Carrying casualties, had moved with tactical awareness that spoke of combat training. Whatever isolation he'd chosen, whatever peace he'd built, Kate's presence had just shattered it. She'd brought violence to someone who deliberately sought safety, had imported corruption's consequences into sanctuary. Guilt joined pain and cold, another weight added to crushing burden. But there was nothing she could do to unmake choices already made, nowhere to go but forward into consequences. She triggered but couldn't control. The truck continued through the storm, carrying three souls toward confrontation they couldn't avoid and futures they couldn't predict. Behind them, fresh snow was already beginning to cover Kate's crashed Civic, erasing evidence of violence beneath white sheets that promised temporary peace but delivered only delay. The storm was coming, in more ways than one. Daniel Harris drove through the worsening blizzard with the focused intensity of someone whose survival had often depended on making correct decisions under pressure. The woman in his passenger seat was fading consciousness, ebbing and flowing in concerning rhythm. Blood had soaked through the makeshift bandaging he'd applied, spreading across the seat despite pressure and elevation. Beside her, Ranger maintained his position, body heat offering what comfort biology could provide. The dog's ears remained alert, tracking sounds through the storm, that military vigilance, refusing to stand down even when immediate threats receded. Daniel's mind was already several steps ahead, calculating supplies, needed procedures, required complications likely. The woman's wounds suggested deliberate violence rather than accidental trauma. Someone had stabbed her with precision, creating injury severe enough to be life-threatening while avoiding immediately fatal damage. Professional work, military or law enforcement training. Someone who knew anatomy and understood how to make death look natural while ensuring it arrived inevitably. That knowledge transformed the situation from medical emergency into tactical problem. Whoever had attacked her might return to confirm the kill. Taking her to a hospital might mean delivering her directly to enemies who wore badges and carried legal authority. But leaving her to die wasn't an option Daniel's conscience would accept. The cabin appeared through the storm windows, glowing with warm light that Lily must have left burning. Home sanctuary, the fortress he'd built against the world's complications. And he was about to import those complications directly past the walls he'd constructed. He parked close to the door, minimizing the distance he'd need to carry the injured officer. Ranger bounded ahead, already moving into protective mode, clearing the path and checking the perimeter despite the storm's interference. Daniel lifted the woman carefully, feeling her weight settle against him in ways that recalled other casualties from other emergencies in other places. Afghanistan had taught him how to carry wounded. The knowledge never faded, just waited dormant until circumstances demanded its application. Inside, the cabin's warmth hit like physical force after the storm's bitter cold. Daniel called out, alerting Lily to unexpected company, giving her time to process the unusual situation. His daughter appeared at the top of the stairs, purple pajamas incongruous against the serious situation unfolding. But her face showed no panic, just careful assessment. She'd been prepared for emergencies, had learned that unexpected crises required calm response rather than emotional reaction. Daniel explained the situation in terms she could understand without unnecessary detail. A police officer had been in an accident. She needed help. They were the only ones available to provide it. Lily nodded, disappeared into her room, returned carrying the first aid kit with practiced efficiency. She'd helped with injuries before, understood that medical situations required sterile supplies and careful procedure. At 7 years old, she possessed composure that would have seemed remarkable to anyone who didn't understand how she'd been raised. Daniel carried the woman to the kitchen table, the cabin's largest flat surface with good lighting. He began cutting away her uniform, exposing the knife wound that bled with concerning persistence. The blade had slipped between ribs, penetrating deep into the intercostal space, missing the lung by inches, maybe less. Luck or skill had saved her life temporarily. Daniel's medical training would have to extend that temporary reprieve into permanent survival. He worked methodically, cleaning the wound with antiseptic, irrigating with saline, inspecting for debris or foreign objects. The knife had been clean at least. No fragments complicating the injury beyond the damage itself. Lily stood beside him, passing supplies before he requested them. Gauze, surgical tape, hemostatic agents, antibiotics from the emergency kit he maintained precisely for situations like this. She watched without flinching as he packed the wound, applying pressure that would slow bleeding while avoiding complications. The woman's eyes fluttered open briefly, pain dragging her back to consciousness. She looked at Lily, managed a weak smile despite agony that must have been overwhelming. Lily's response came naturally, child's comfort offered to suffering adult. She introduced herself formally, including her age with mathematical precision, explaining about Ranger, with the kind of detail that 7-year-olds use to make frightening situations feel more normal. Daniel continued working, stabilizing vital signs, establishing baseline measurements. Blood pressure was low but not critically so. Pulse was rapid but strong. Breathing was labored but effective. She'd lost blood, but probably not enough to require transfusion if he could stop the bleeding and prevent infection. The wound was clean now, packed with hemostatic gauze, covered with sterile dressing, secured with surgical tape that would hold against movement. Daniel started an IV line, pushing fluids to combat shock and blood loss. Added broad-spectrum antibiotics to prevent infection. Administered pain medication that would take the edge off agony without suppressing respiratory drive. Lily helped throughout, her small hands following his instructions precisely. She fetched supplies, held pressure, adjusted the IV stand, performed tasks with competence that would have seemed impossible for her age to outside observers. But Daniel had been preparing her for exactly this kind of emergency. Not because he had anticipated finding stabbed police officers in snowbanks, but because wilderness living meant medical help might not arrive in time to make a difference. Better she possessed skills never needed than need skills never learned. The immediate crisis stabilized. Daniel sent Lily to brush her teeth and prepare for bed. Normal routines maintained despite extraordinary circumstances. She obeyed without argument, understanding that adults sometimes needed to discuss things children shouldn't overhear. Once she disappeared upstairs, the woman forced words through pain and exhaustion. Her story emerged in fragments, pieces of conspiracy that sounded like paranoid fantasy, except for the evidence lying in her wounds. Cedar Falls Police Department, systematic corruption, drug distribution through evidence lockup, weapons sales to criminal networks, officers and officials enriching themselves while communities they'd sworn to protect paid the price in addiction and violence and shattered trust. She'd gathered evidence, 3 months of careful documentation, recordings, photographs, financial records. Enough proof to trigger federal investigation and dozens of indictments. She'd been driving to meet an FBI agent in Denver when they'd run her off the road. Daniel listened, his military experience translating her information into threat assessment. If what she claimed was true, then helping her meant accepting target status. Corrupt police with institutional power and legal authority would stop at nothing to recover evidence and eliminate witnesses. Taking her in meant endangering Lily, but abandoning her meant accepting that corruption could flourish unopposed, that people who wore badges could commit crimes with impunity, that justice was negotiable when inconvenient. Maria's voice echoed in memory, her final words before morphine took her beyond pain into permanent sleep. Promise me you'll raise her to be brave, to do what's right even when it's hard. Daniel had made that promise. Breaking it now would mean betraying not just his wife's memory, but the fundamental principles he'd been teaching their daughter. The woman pressed something into his palm, her fingers weak but urgent. A USB drive, small and innocuous, containing evidence that justified murder. She explained through labored breathing that everything was there. 3 months of recordings, documents, proof. The whole department rotten from the top down. Daniel closed his fingers around the drive, feeling its weight both literal and metaphorical. This tiny piece of plastic and silicon represented lives destroyed and lives saved, justice delayed and justice possible. Taking possession meant assuming responsibility, accepting that his isolated sanctuary was about to become battleground. Ranger's sudden alertness interrupted the moment, the dog's body tensing in that way that meant threats approaching. His training manifested in raised hackles, the low rumble building in his chest. 30 seconds later, Daniel heard what the shepherd had detected earlier. Engines, multiple vehicles, moving with deliberate purpose up his private road despite storm conditions that should have made the journey difficult. This wasn't random. They'd been tracked either through technology or old-fashioned pursuit. The people who'd tried to kill this woman were coming to finish the job. Daniel moved quickly, muscle memory overriding conscious thought. The rifle came from his bedroom closet along with the go bag he'd always kept packed. Cash documents, medical supplies, ammunition. Old habits from a life where preparedness meant the difference between survival and casualty. Lily appeared in her doorway, already dressed in winter gear, somehow sensing danger without explicit warning. She'd pulled on boots with practiced efficiency, grabbed her own small pack that contained essentials they'd prepared together years ago. No 7-year-old should be this comfortable with danger, this ready to flee into a blizzard. But the world didn't care what should be, only what was. Daniel lifted the injured woman, distributing her weight across his shoulders in a fireman's carry that Afghanistan had taught him years ago. Lily climbed onto his back, arms tight around his neck, legs wrapped around his waist. Together they weighed perhaps 130 pounds, manageable for someone who'd carried 60-pound rucksacks through mountains for years. They slipped out the back door as the first vehicle pulled into the front drive. Ranger led them into the forest he knew better than any human military training, evident in how he scouted and reported back through body language Daniel could read. The storm had intensified, wind driving snow horizontal, erasing their tracks almost instantly. Behind them, flashlight beams swept through the cabin windows like searching fingers. Voices carried on the wind, professional, organized, dangerous. These weren't local cops making overtime. This was a tactical team with specific orders and training to carry them out. Daniel moved through the forest using memory and instinct, navigating paths he'd walked hundreds of times. The injured woman's weight pressed against his shoulders, her breathing labored, her consciousness flickering. Lily's grip around his neck remained steady, her face buried against his jacket, occasional sobs indicating she was still conscious. Behind them, the sounds changed, engines giving way to higher-pitched whine of snowmobiles. They had better equipment, more resources, institutional backing. Daniel had tactical knowledge and intimate familiarity with terrain. The mathematics of pursuit suggested eventual capture was probable. But probable wasn't certain, and Daniel had survived longer odds in places where mistakes meant death. He'd survived Afghanistan. He'd survived Maria's death and the grinding pain of single parenthood. He'd survived this too because failure meant his daughter facing consequences he couldn't accept. The forest path twisted through pine groves and across frozen streams. Lily's weight felt heavier with each step, not from increasing mass, but from accumulating exhaustion. The injured woman had gone limp, unconscious, or dead. Daniel couldn't determine while moving. Snowmobiles were getting closer, their headlights occasionally visible through the trees. Daniel made a decision that went against every paternal instinct. He changed direction, veering toward a cluster of massive boulders Lily and he had explored the previous summer. The overhang wasn't really a cave, more of a deep shelter created by ancient geological forces, but it would provide protection from wind and snow, would hide them from casual search, would buy time to rest and regroup. Daniel lowered the injured woman onto relatively dry ground beneath the rock shelf, then began excavating snow to create a windbreak. Lily helped with desperate efficiency, her small hands moving through powder, piling it into walls that would block wind and conceal their position. Ranger positioned himself at the entrance ears, swiveling to track sounds through the storm. His body remained tense, ready to fight despite exhaustion. The snowmobiles drew closer, their sound carrying through cold air with crystalline clarity. Daniel could see their headlights, now beams cutting through the white chaos, searching patterns suggesting tactical training. He knelt before Lily, taking her face in his hands, memorizing every detail in case this was the last time. His voice carried weight of everything he couldn't say, all the love and fear and desperate hope compressed into simple instruction. He explained that he needed to lead them away, needed to draw pursuit from this position before they found the overhang. She would stay here with Kate and Ranger, stay quiet no matter what she heard, wait for him to return. Lily's face crumpled, tears tracking down wind-burned cheeks. She didn't want him to go, wanted him to stay where she could see him, wanted the impossible guarantee that everything would be okay. Daniel kissed her forehead, that gesture parents had made since time immemorial. Love disguised as blessing. Promise wrapped in touch. Then he was gone, vanishing into the storm with the rifle across his back, moving to intercept the search pattern before it could reach his daughter. He circled wide, using terrain features to mask his movement until he could observe the pursuit team. 4 men in police tactical gear, faces hidden behind balaclavas, night vision goggles pushed up because the weather rendered them useless. One carried thermal imaging, sweeping it through the forest. That was the primary threat. Body heat would show clearly against cold background, betraying their position despite the storm's concealment. Daniel moved with silent precision, positioning himself behind the rearmost rider, waiting for the perfect moment when wind and engine noise would mask his approach. The takedown was swift, brutal. The rider unconscious before he hit the ground. Daniel zip-tied his wrists and ankles with restraints from the tactical vest, then destroyed the thermal imager with his rifle butt. The device shattered its components, scattering across snow. He shouted into the storm, deliberately different voice, sending the other 3 riders racing toward empty forest. Then he melted back into white chaos, circling back to the overhang, where 3 pairs of frightened eyes watched him emerge. The woman was barely conscious now, skin burning with fever despite the cold. Lily shivered uncontrollably despite Ranger's warmth pressed against her. They couldn't stay here. The overhang provided temporary shelter, but they'd freeze before morning if they didn't find better protection. Daniel knew where they needed to go. 2 miles northeast, an abandoned ranger station that represented their best chance of surviving both the storm and the pursuit. He'd discovered the structure his first winter had cached supplies there during the darkest period after Maria's death. The building was solid despite decades of abandonment, positioned on a ridge with clear sight lines in all directions. Defensible if it came to that, and increasingly it seemed it would come to that. Daniel lifted the woman despite her weak protest, felt her weight settle across his shoulders. Lily climbed onto his back, her grip tight with desperation. Together they pushed forward through drifts that reached Daniel's waist, in places each step requiring enormous effort. The last mile took forever, time stretching like taffy as exhaustion accumulated into near immobility. Lily clung to his back like a barnacle, her breathing shallow but steady. The woman drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling about evidence and corruption. Ranger broke trail where he could, his powerful body creating paths through lighter snow, occasionally circling back to check on his humans with worried eyes. The station finally appeared through the storm, a darker shadow against white chaos. Its door hung off hinges, snow drifted through broken windows, but the stone fireplace remained intact. Daniel's cache supplies waited inside emergency rations and first aid supplies he'd rotated and maintained over years. He worked with desperate efficiency, once inside barricading the door, with an old table stuffing jackets into window gaps, starting a fire with wood that previous visitors had stacked along one wall. The woman's fever had spiked dangerously, her skin burning even as she shivered. Daniel crushed antibiotics into water, forcing her to drink despite her weakness. Lily huddled by the growing fire, Ranger pressed against her, both watching Daniel work with absolute trust that he could fix this, could make everything safe again. Outside, the storm continued its assault, wind howling through gaps in the structure. Daniel added wood to the fire, built it higher, trying to warm the space before hypothermia could add its complications to their situation. Lily's voice came small in the darkness. She asked the question children always asked in situations beyond their understanding. The question that had no good answer, only honest ones. Daniel told her the truth as gently as he could. The woman wouldn't die if he could help it. But privately, he calculated odds that grew worse with each passing hour. She needed a hospital surgical intervention, resources he couldn't provide in an abandoned building during a blizzard. The USB drive sat heavy in his pocket, its contents potentially worth multiple lives. But whose lives and at what cost? He needed information, needed intelligence to plan their next move. So he asked the woman to tell him everything, despite her obvious exhaustion and pain. Who exactly was involved? How deep did the corruption go? Through chattering teeth and fever-dulled thoughts, she painted a picture of systematic betrayal. Chief Morrison ran the operation with corporate efficiency, at least 15 officers involved, maybe more. Drug sales generating hundreds of thousands monthly. Confiscated weapons disappearing into black market sales. Evidence vanishing when the price was right. She tried going to the FBI, made contact with an agent in Denver, arranged to meet tomorrow. But they'd realize what she was doing. The accident was supposed to look natural, tragic, but not suspicious. Daniel absorbed the information, translating it into threat assessment. If she was telling the truth and her wounds suggested she was, then they faced enemies with institutional power and legal authority. Enemies who would stop at nothing to recover evidence and eliminate witnesses. Ranger's growl interrupted, low and continuous. Through cracks in the boarded windows, Daniel saw lights. Flashlights carefully coordinated surrounding the station. They'd been found again, but this time there was nowhere to run. The woman could barely remain conscious. Lily was exhausted and hypothermic. Daniel's shoulder had begun stiffening, where old shrapnel scars protested the cold and exertion. They'd reached the end of running, the moment where flight became impossible, and only fight remained. A voice carried through the storm, amplified by megaphone, but still recognizable enough to freeze Daniel's blood with recognition that cut deeper than any physical cold. The voice belonged to Mark Evans, his former squad mate, the man who'd dragged him from a burning Humvee after an IED tore through their convoy, who'd held pressure on his wounds for 3 hours until medevac arrived, who'd stood beside him at Maria's funeral and promised to always be there if Daniel needed anything. Mark, who'd brought Lily that stuffed rabbit she still carried everywhere. Mark, who'd sent Christmas cards every year since Daniel's discharge. Mark, whose voice now carried threat instead of friendship through the storm. The words came clear despite wind and distance. Daniel's name spoken with familiar warmth, followed by reasonable-sounding suggestion that they talk, that they handle this like civilized people. Send out the officer and whatever she gave him. Take Lily home. No one wants to hurt a child. The tactical psychology was transparent. Establish emotional connection. Create false choices, manipulate through personal history. But knowing the technique didn't eliminate its effectiveness, especially when the voice belonged to someone who'd literally saved your life. Daniel looked at his daughter, her face illuminated by firelight, trust absolute despite fear widening her eyes. This was the moment that would define who she became, what she believed about right and wrong, whether standing up mattered even when standing seemed impossible. Everything he taught her, everything Maria had wanted for their daughter, came down to the choice he made in the next few seconds. Outside, Mark continued speaking, offering reasonable-sounding alternatives that would preserve Daniel's life and Lily's safety. Just surrender the evidence in the dying cop. Simple choice. Easy choice. Except it wasn't. Because Maria's voice echoed in memory her last coherent words before morphine took her under. Promise me you'll raise her to be brave, to do what's right, even when it's hard. Daniel met Lily's eyes, saw her watching him with that particular intensity children used when trying to understand adult decisions that would shape their understanding of the world. She needed to see courage modeled, needed to learn that principles mattered more than convenience, that some things were worth fighting for even when fighting seemed hopeless. He made his choice, made it with full knowledge of probable consequences, accepting the risk because accepting corruption would have cost more than any physical danger could threaten. His response carried through the storm words that would either save them or doom them, but words that were true regardless of outcome. He told Mark to come and get her if he wanted her. Reminded him that Daniel had learned everything about tactical combat from Mark himself, that Mark would be testing his own training if he chose this path. Outside silence stretched through the storm. Then came the sound Daniel had both expected and dreaded. The metallic clink of a gas canister hitting the floor, white smoke beginning to billow into the room. Daniel grabbed Lily, pushed her toward the root cellar he'd discovered during previous visits, a hole beneath rotted floorboards that connected to natural cave systems below. Down now, Ranger guard. The dog followed Lily into darkness, while Daniel helped Kate toward the cellar. The door exploded inward, men in tactical gear flooding through smoke. Daniel met them with controlled violence, using the rifle stock as a club, the confined space negating their numerical advantage. His body remembered combat in ways his mind had tried to forget muscle memory, guiding strikes that disabled without killing. He wouldn't make Lily watch him take lives unless absolutely necessary. But there were too many, too coordinated. Daniel was one man protecting two vulnerable people against a professional team. They overwhelmed him through numbers and coordination, driving him back through the smoke-filled room. Then Mark entered, older, now gray, threading through his beard, the same calm competence that had made him an excellent soldier evident in how he moved. Their eyes met through the smoke. Years of shared danger creating understanding without words. Mark's voice carried sadness, along with determination. He raised his weapon, ending this the only way it could end. But Daniel moved faster, the rifle stock crushing into Mark's wrist, sending the pistol spinning away into shadows. They grappled, crashing into walls, each knowing the other's moves like a deadly dance they'd rehearsed in a dozen firefights. Mark got position, his arm around Daniel's throat, the chokehold that would end consciousness in seconds. Daniel's vision began to narrow, darkness creeping in from the edges. His daughter's face filled his fading awareness. Lily watching from the cellar entrance, where she shouldn't be, where she should have stayed hidden. Her scream erupted from the darkness, followed by Ranger launching himself from the shadows. 90 pounds of trained aggression, striking Mark at chest level, driving him down, hard jaws locked on his arm, with pressure that stopped just short of breaking bones. A warning, not an attack. The distinction mattered, preserved something human in the chaos. Kate's voice cut through everything, impossibly strong given her condition. She'd found Mark's dropped weapon, held it steady despite tremor in her legs, despite fever and blood loss and exhaustion. Her words carried absolute conviction that froze everyone in place. The tactical team stopped training, warring with loyalty, self-preservation, calculating odds. Mark lay still beneath Ranger blood seeping through his sleeve, face twisted in pain, and something else that might have been shame. And Daniel, still gasping for breath, looked at his daughter, standing in the cellar entrance, her face reflecting every bit of trauma and terror and desperate courage, and understood that regardless of how this ended, she would carry these images forever. The next few minutes would determine whether those images represented salvation or tragedy, whether the choice he'd made to stand up had been courage or catastrophic judgment, whether Maria's final request had been wisdom or cruel burden placed on shoulders already carrying too much weight. Outside, sirens began to wail in the distance, growing closer. Real ones this time, carrying help or bringing more enemies. Time would tell which. Inside the ranger station, 7 people and 1 dog waited in frozen tableau, each carrying their own calculations about survival and sacrifice, about duty and corruption, about what price they were willing to pay for principles that suddenly seemed both infinitely precious and impossibly naive. The fire Daniel had built continued burning, warming the space, creating shadows that danced across walls like the ghosts of choices past and consequences yet to come. Snow continued falling outside, covering the world in white sheets that promised peace, but delivered only the temporary illusion of cleansing. And somewhere in the darkness, in the chaos of that moment, balanced between resolution and disaster, the USB drive in Daniel's pocket pressed against his ribs like a second heartbeat, evidence of corruption that had already cost so much and promised to demand more before the storm finally passed. The sirens grew louder, their wail cutting through the wind's howl with mechanical insistence. Mark Evans remained pinned beneath Ranger's weight, blood spreading across his tactical sleeve where the dog's teeth had found purchase. His eyes met Daniel's across the smoke-hazed space, carrying recognition that went deeper than present circumstances. Kate's hand trembled, holding the weapon, fever making her grip uncertain despite determination in her voice. The tactical officers had lowered their rifles but maintained ready positions, fingers near triggers, bodies coiled for violence that required only the slightest provocation. One officer broke the silence, his voice younger than the others, carrying doubt instead of conviction. His question hung in the air like smoke from the waste canister, still hissing in the corner. Whether Kate's claim about transmitted evidence was true seemed irrelevant against the larger reality of what they'd become. Another responded with a bitter awareness that they'd crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. Coming here to kill a cop and a child wasn't what anyone had signed up for, wasn't the career any of them had imagined when they took their oaths. Mark's voice carried quiet authority despite his position beneath 80 pounds of trained aggression. He ordered his team to stand down, repeating the command when hesitation suggested they might not comply. The words emerged with finality, acceptance that whatever came next, this particular operation had reached its conclusion. Weapons lowered incrementally, hands raised in gestures of surrender that looked alien on men trained for dominance. The group psychology shifted in ways Daniel recognized from Afghanistan, that moment when unit cohesion fractured and survival instinct overrode orders. These weren't hardened criminals. They were cops who'd made bad choices, who justified small compromises, until they found themselves in an abandoned ranger station preparing to murder innocents. The distance between those 2 points seemed impossible to bridge, yet here they stood, testament to how gradually corruption consumed conscience. Daniel maintained his position, rifle ready, but not aimed, trusting the surrender about as far as circumstances allowed. Ranger seemed to sense the change in atmosphere, his jaws releasing Mark's arm, though he remained positioned to attack if the threat resurged. Mark struggled to sitting position, cradling his injured arm. His face showed pain, but something deeper beneath it, something that might have been relief mixed with resignation. When he spoke, his words carried weight of confession rather than threat. He told Kate she had no idea what she'd started, that this corruption reached higher than she knew. Judges, state officials, people with resources to make problems disappear permanently. Testifying wouldn't keep her safe, wouldn't protect any of them from reach that extended far beyond Cedar Falls. Daniel helped Mark fully upright while keeping the rifle positioned for quick deployment. His response came measured, acknowledging the danger while refusing to accept defeat as inevitable. Whatever time they had, they'd make it count. The sirens reached the ranger station vehicles, pulling up outside with official authority. State police and FBI converging on coordinates Kate had managed to transmit before leaving the cabin, a detail she'd neglected to mention during earlier explanations, but which now appeared as salvation rather than complication. Mark laughed, the sound carrying bitter recognition that his choices had led inevitably to this moment. Gravity didn't negotiate, didn't offer second chances, just pulled everything toward consequences that couldn't be avoided. His apology emerged quietly, directed at Daniel but encompassing everyone present. He explained about Emily, about threats made against his daughter, about the photographs that would destroy her future if he didn't comply. When she needed protection, when they held leverage over her safety, he should have found another way, instead of becoming what he'd sworn to fight. Daniel absorbed the confession without judgment, thinking of Lily hiding in the cellar, imagining someone threatening her. His admission came reluctantly, acknowledging he didn't know what he would have done faced with identical circumstances. But he knew Maria would never forgive him if he bought Lily's safety with other people's suffering. The next hour became controlled chaos as legitimate law enforcement sorted through the scene. State police in their distinctive uniforms, FBI agents in tactical gear, federal marshals establishing perimeter security. Overlapping jurisdictions that prevented any single group from controlling the narrative or manipulating evidence. Kate surrendered the USB drive to a female FBI agent who'd driven through the blizzard from Denver, starting chain of custody that would eventually reach prosecutors capable of handling corruption at this scale. The agent's face showed professional detachment, but her eyes reflected understanding of what Kate had risked to deliver this evidence. Daniel sat in an ambulance, exhaustion, hitting with physical force now that adrenaline was fading. Lily pressed against his side, refusing to release his hand even when paramedics needed to check his vitals. Ranger lay across their feet, his muzzle still showing traces of Mark's blood, a reminder of violence that had come terrifyingly close to consuming them all. Through the ambulance's open doors, they watched Kate being loaded onto a stretcher. IV lines ran into both arms, oxygen mask covering her face, but her eyes remained fierce with satisfaction. She'd done it, accomplished what had seemed impossible, exposed truth despite overwhelming opposition. Lily's question came small and tired, her voice reflecting trauma that would require years to process fully. Daniel's response carried truth softened by hope, telling her Kate was tough, resilient in ways that went beyond physical endurance. The comparison to Maria emerged naturally, connecting past loss to present survival, teaching Lily that women possess strength manifesting in countless forms. His daughter's agreement came with understanding beyond her years, recognition that some qualities transcended individual lives to become legacy. The FBI agent approached as paramedics finished their assessment, her badge identifying her as Sarah Chen, the contact Kate had arranged to meet. Her questions were professional, but compassionate, understanding that Daniel had stumbled into this situation rather than seeking it, that his actions had saved lives rather than complicated them. Daniel provided information economically explaining the sequence of events without embellishment. He'd found Kate dying in the snow, brought her to his cabin, fled when her attackers arrived. Simple facts that avoided the larger questions about whether he'd made correct choices, whether risking Lily had been justified. Chen seemed to understand what he wasn't saying, the guilt that came from endangering his daughter for principles that suddenly seemed abstract against her tear-stained face. She assured him that his actions had prevented a miscarriage of justice, that without his intervention, Kate would have died and corruption would have continued unchecked. The words provided small comfort. Daniel kept seeing Lily's face as she'd emerged from the cellar, kept hearing her scream as Ranger attacked Mark. Those images would haunt both of them, trauma that couldn't be erased by reassurances about doing the right thing. The storm had begun to clear, wind dying down, snowfall reducing to light flurries. Dawn approached with reluctant light filtering through clouds, illuminating a world transformed by white accumulation. The forest looked peaceful, beautiful, even belying the violence that had unfolded beneath its branches. Mark was loaded into a separate ambulance, his arm requiring medical attention, though Ranger's bite had been carefully measured. Federal agents flanked him, ensuring he reached the hospital under custody rather than as a free man. His career was over his freedom, measured in whatever deal prosecutors offered in exchange for testimony. Daniel watched the ambulance depart, feeling no satisfaction in his former friend's downfall. Just sadness for choices that had seemed reasonable at the time, for compromises that had accumulated into catastrophe, for good people corrupted by circumstances they hadn't possessed the courage to resist. Afghanistan had taught Daniel about moral complexity, about how good soldiers could commit terrible acts when orders and circumstances aligned badly. He'd witnessed men he respected making decisions that haunted them afterward, choosing between bad options without the luxury of moral clarity. The memory surfaced unbidden, pulling him back across years and continents to desert heat and constant danger. Kandahar province, summer heat making every breath feel like inhaling fire. Daniel's squad had been conducting patrol through a village that intelligence suggested harbored Taliban fighters. Mark had been point man Daniel covering his six when they discovered the school. It wasn't supposed to be operational. Intelligence had reported the building abandoned, possibly rigged with IEDs, definitely suspicious. But when they'd breached the entrance, they'd found 15 children and 2 teachers huddled in the corner, terrified by soldiers who'd burst through their door with weapons raised. The colonel commanding their operation had ordered them to clear the building anyway, citing security concerns that seemed flimsy against the reality of children's faces. Mark had refused, directly stating he wouldn't follow orders that endangered non-combatants. The confrontation had been tense, career-ending for Mark if the colonel had chosen to push it. But Daniel had supported his friend's decision, backed him against superior authority, and eventually the colonel had backed down. They'd left the school intact, children's safe principles preserved. It had been the right choice, even though it had earned them both reprimands and skeptical oversight for months afterward. That memory made Mark's current situation even more painful. The man who'd stood up to a colonel to protect children had somehow become someone threatening to kill a 7-year-old to protect corrupt colleagues. The distance between those two versions of Mark Evans seemed impossible to reconcile. Yet Daniel understood enough about human weakness to know that courage wasn't permanent, that everyone possessed breaking points where principles yielded to pressure. Mark's daughter had been that breaking point, the lever that moved someone who'd seemed unmovable. Another memory surfaced, more recent but no less significant. Mark visiting the cabin 2 years after Daniel had moved in, bringing gifts for Lily, spending an afternoon helping repair the roof. They'd worked in comfortable silence, hands remembering tasks learned together in service conversation, flowing easily around topics that mattered and those that didn't. Mark had asked about how Daniel was managing, whether isolation was healing or just hiding. The question had been genuine concern from someone who understood trauma's long shadow. Daniel's answer had been honest, admitting he didn't know the difference anymore, that sometimes safety and surrender looked identical from inside grief's fog. That version of Mark had been authentic, Daniel believed. The corruption hadn't been inevitable, hadn't been present in his nature. Circumstances had created it, pressure, finding weakness, leveraging love against integrity until good man made terrible choices. Understanding didn't excuse. Empathy didn't eliminate accountability. But it complicated the narrative of heroes and villains that Lily would need to process this experience. The FBI began coordinating departure, organizing transport for everyone who'd been present. Daniel declined their offer of protective custody, arguing that isolation had kept them safe for 6 years and would continue doing so. Chen reluctantly agreed but provided contact numbers for immediate response if threats materialized. Lily had fallen asleep against Daniel's shoulder, exhaustion finally overwhelming her. She looked impossibly young. Vulnerability emphasized by the tactical vest Daniel had draped over her for warmth, by the bloodstains marking her purple pajamas, where Kate had bled during the initial rescue. No child should wear blood like badge of honor. No 7-year-old should fall asleep in ambulances surrounded by federal agents discussing prosecution strategy. But Lily had lived experiences most children never imagined, had developed resilience born from loss and necessity. Daniel lifted her gently, carrying her toward the FBI vehicle that would transport them to the hospital where Kate was being treated. Ranger followed closely, his protective instincts undiminished despite exhaustion, visible in how he moved. The drive down the mountain took an hour, roads treacherous despite plowing efforts. Dawn had fully broken, revealing landscape transformed by snowfall. Trees bowed under white roads, carved through drifts that reached several feet in places. Beautiful and deadly nature's indifference to human drama, illustrated in frozen perfection. At the hospital, they were shown to a private waiting room, given coffee and food that Daniel couldn't quite bring himself to eat. Lily woke briefly, accepted hot chocolate with small sips, then returned to sleep in the chair beside him. Hours passed in strange suspension time, moving differently in hospital spaces where crisis and routine existed simultaneously. Doctors emerged periodically with updates on Kate's condition. Surgery, successful, infection, controlled prognosis, good though recovery would require weeks. Daniel felt relief disproportionate to his actual connection with the woman he'd saved. She was a stranger whose emergency had become his crisis, yet her survival mattered beyond rational calculation. Perhaps because her living meant the choices he'd made had been justified, that risking Lily hadn't been for nothing. Afternoon sun was painting the waiting room in long shadows when Chen returned with information. The USB drive had been analyzed, contents verified, evidence cataloged. What Kate had collected would trigger prosecution of not just the 15 officers initially identified, but dozens more across multiple departments and jurisdictions. The corruption investigation would continue for years, Chen explained. Trials and appeals and ongoing discovery as the full scope became clear. Kate would be central witness, her testimony essential but dangerous. The FBI was offering witness protection, relocation, new identity if she chose to accept. For Daniel and Lily, protection was available, but Chen acknowledged their isolation had served them well. She could arrange monitoring of their property, regular check-ins, rapid response capability if needed. But forcing relocation seemed unnecessary given their existing security measures. Daniel accepted the compromise, grateful to preserve the life they'd built while acknowledging it had been permanently altered. They couldn't return to complete isolation, couldn't pretend the world's complications hadn't found them. But they could continue living on their terms, adapted to include awareness of threats that had always existed but now carried specific faces and names. Lily woke as evening approached, disoriented by unfamiliar surroundings. Daniel explained where they were, why, what would happen next. Her questions came in clusters, each answer triggering new inquiries about justice and police, and whether bad people could be good sometimes. He answered with honesty tempered by age-appropriate framing, explaining moral complexity without crushing her faith in basic goodness. Yes, Mark had done terrible things. Yes, he'd once been a good man. Both could be true simultaneously, humans containing capacity for nobility and corruption in measure that circumstances revealed. Lily absorbed his explanations with serious concentration, her young mind wrestling with concepts that challenged even adult understanding. Finally, she asked the question that mattered most to her, whether Daddy was okay, whether what happened meant they were in danger. Daniel pulled her close, feeling her small body fit against his with perfect trust, despite everything she'd witnessed. His reassurance was honest without being complete, confirming they were safe while acknowledging life had changed. But change didn't always mean worse. Sometimes it meant different, adapted stronger for having survived. Kate was moved from ICU to regular room by evening, her condition stabilized enough to allow visitors. Daniel brought Lily to see her, thinking his daughter might need concrete proof that her fear and discomfort had saved a life. Kate looked pale against white sheets, tubes, and monitors creating mechanical forest around her bed. but her eyes were alert, tracking Lily's entrance with recognition and warmth. When she spoke, her voice carried weakness, but also profound gratitude. She thanked Lily specifically, acknowledging the child's bravery, her competence under pressure, her willingness to help despite fear. The words mattered more than adult recognition would have validation from someone whose survival testified to Lily's significance. Lily beamed, then grew serious, asking Kate the question that had apparently been bothering her. Whether police could be good again, whether what happened meant no one could be trusted. Kate's response was measured, explaining that most officers were honorable, that corruption was exception rather than rule, that individual character mattered more than institutional affiliation. She acknowledged failing to stand up sooner, accepting responsibility for months when she'd witnessed wrong without acting. But she promised Lily that good people existed everywhere, that standing up mattered even when dangerous, that justice was worth fighting for despite its frequent failures. The conversation was adult in content, but delivered with respect for Lily's capacity to understand nuance. They stayed 20 minutes before exhaustion, claimed Kate again, her body demanding rest to heal trauma, both physical and systemic. Daniel and Lily left with promises to visit again, with understanding that Kate's recovery would connect their lives in ways that extended beyond single night's crisis. The FBI arranged temporary hotel accommodation rooms in a facility near the hospital with security monitoring. Daniel accepted gratefully, too exhausted to drive the mountain roads in darkness, too aware of Lily's need for safe sleep without nightmares interrupting. They showered, washing away blood and smoke and fear. Daniel helped Lily with her hair, working through tangles with gentle patience, finding meditation in simple tasks. She talked continuously, processing experience through verbalization, asking questions that couldn't be fully answered but deserved honest attempts. When she finally slept, Daniel sat in the connecting room, unable to quiet his own mind. The day replayed in fragments, moments when different choices might have led to catastrophe. Finding Kate could have meant driving past, leaving her to die, preserving his isolation. Taking her to hospital instead of home might have delivered her to enemies waiting in institutional authority. Every decision had carried risks. Every choice could have ended badly. That some had worked out felt more like luck than wisdom, chance favoring principles rather than proof that principles deserve favoring. His phone buzzed with message from Chen providing case updates and security briefings. 15 officers in custody, 3 more identified, through evidence analysis warrants being issued. Chief Morrison arrested at his home, his detailed record-keeping becoming prosecution's most valuable asset. The empire of corruption beginning to collapse under weight of its own documentation. Daniel felt no triumph, just weary acknowledgement that justice was grinding forward, that Kate's courage had meant something beyond her personal sacrifice. The system was broken, but not beyond repair, corrupted, but not completely compromised. Individual actions still mattered, still moved outcomes, still justified risk. Maria's voice echoed in memory words from their last coherent conversation before morphine took her beyond pain. She'd made him promise things that had seemed impossibly heavy, especially the charge to raise Lily believing in goodness, despite evidence suggesting cynicism, was more realistic. Tonight, Daniel had honored that promise, though the cost had been terror he wouldn't wish on any parent. Lily had learned that principles mattered, that standing up changed outcomes, that ordinary people could face extraordinary circumstances and survive. Whether those lessons were worth the trauma remained unknowable, impact measurable only across years of development yet to unfold. He checked on his daughter one final time before attempting sleep. She lay curled around the stuffed rabbit thumb in her mouth, despite being too old for such comfort. The gesture broke his heart, reminder that beneath competence and resilience remained a child who needed safety more than she needed adventure. Tomorrow, they'd return to their cabin, assess damage from the breach repair. What could be fixed? Life would continue, adapted to include awareness it had previously lacked. Isolation would feel different, knowing it could be penetrated, knowing threats existed with specific intention rather than abstract possibility. But they would survive because survival was what they'd always done, what Maria had taught through her grace in dying, what Lily inherited through DNA and observation. The Harris family endured, adapted, found ways forward through circumstances that seemed impossible until they weren't. Outside the hotel window, Cedar Falls spread beneath them, a small town harboring secrets now exposed to harsh light. Somewhere in the same building, Mark Evans likely lay in his own room, guarded by federal agents contemplating choices that had seemed reasonable until viewed from their inevitable conclusion. Daniel felt no satisfaction in his friend's fall, just sadness for corruption's arithmetic, for how good people became complicit through incremental compromise. Mark would face justice, would pay for choices made under pressure that had seemed overwhelming at the time. But Mark had also saved Daniel's life, once had been genuine friend, when friendship mattered, had shown Lily kindness when kindness was freely given. That history didn't excuse present crimes, but prevented simple narratives about heroes and villains. The world was more complicated than Lily's storybooks suggested, more nuanced than clear categories allowed. People contained multitude circumstances, revealed character in ways that defied prediction. Tonight's lessons included those truths, teaching complexity alongside courage, showing that justice was messy even when necessary. Daniel finally allowed himself to sleep, exhaustion overriding vigilance, trusting federal protection to maintain security his own awareness couldn't sustain. His dreams were fragmented, mixing past and present, Maria and Kate and Mark and Lily blending into narrative that made sense only in sleep's logic. When he woke hours later, dawn light filtering through hotel curtains, the first thought was gratitude. They were alive. Lily was safe. Kate would recover. Justice was being served, however imperfectly. The cost had been high, but not catastrophic. They would carry scars, psychological and emotional, but they would carry them forward into futures that remained possible. And sometimes Daniel thought pulling his sleeping daughter close, sometimes that was enough. The drive back to the cabin took place under crystalline blue sky, the storm's departure, leaving behind air so clear it hurt to breathe. Lily sat silent in the passenger seat, watching the landscape she'd fled through in terror, now rendered peaceful by daylight and exhaustion. Ranger occupied the back, his presence offering steady comfort that required no words. Daniel navigated the mountain roads with mechanical precision, his mind already cataloging the work awaiting them. The cabin had been breached, searched, possibly damaged. Their sanctuary had been violated, and returning meant confronting that violation in ways that would reshape their understanding of safety. The dirt road appeared less threatening in daylight, though snowdrifts remained treacherous in places where wind had sculpted white mountains across the path. Daniel engaged four-wheel drive, feeling the truck grip and pull through obstacles that would have stopped conventional vehicles. When the cabin materialized through the trees, Lily's sharp intake of breath told him she was remembering their flight, overlaying present calm against past terror. He reached across the seat, found her hands squeezed gently. They would face this together as they'd faced everything since Maria's death. The front door hung open, snow drifted inside, creating surreal landscape where interior met exterior without clear boundary. Daniel approached cautiously despite FBI assurances that the scene was secure, old instincts refusing to trust completely. Inside damage was significant but not catastrophic. Furniture overturned, drawers, emptied contents scattered across floors. The tactical team had searched thoroughly, looking for evidence Kate might have hidden for weapons Daniel might have cached. They'd found neither because Kate had carried her evidence and Daniel's preparations had been elsewhere. Lily moved through the destruction with careful steps, picking up her books, her drawings, the small treasures children accumulated. She didn't cry, didn't rage, just methodically collected pieces of her life and began restoring order with determined precision. Daniel joined her, writing furniture, sweeping snow, closing the door against cold that had claimed their space. The work was physical, satisfying, productive. Each item returned to its place represented reclamation territory taken back from chaos. They worked through the morning, pausing only for food Daniel prepared from supplies that had survived intact. Sandwiches eaten standing up, fuel rather than meal sustenance for labor that had become meditation. By afternoon, the cabin looked almost normal, surface order, masking deeper violation. Daniel knew the psychological impact would persist longer than physical evidence, that Lily would remember strangers violating their sanctuary even after visible damage disappeared. That evening, after Lily had fallen asleep clutching her rabbit, Daniel sat on the porch despite freezing temperatures. The forest stretched before him, familiar territory that no longer felt entirely safe. Knowledge had changed perception, awareness, of how easily isolation could be penetrated, transforming what had seemed like fortress into something more fragile. His phone buzzed with messages from Chen, updates on the investigation that was consuming Cedar Falls. The media had discovered the story, news crews descending on the small town, broadcasting images of officers being led away in handcuffs, interviewing citizens who expressed shock that seemed performative rather than genuine. Everyone claimed ignorance. But Daniel suspected many had chosen not to see, had accepted corruption as price of stability. Small towns operated on complex social contracts where challenging authority meant risking community standing, where loyalty to neighbors outweighed abstract principles. The following days established new rhythm life, adapting to include security measures that had previously seemed unnecessary. Daniel installed cameras, motion sensors, upgraded locks. The preparations felt both essential and futile, technological band-aids applied to wounds that went deeper than hardware could address. Lily noticed but didn't comment, accepting these changes with the same resilience she'd shown throughout. She returned to her studies with focused intensity, perhaps finding comfort in mathematics and science subjects that followed predictable rules unlike the chaos human behavior introduced. 2 weeks after the ranger station confrontation, Chen requested Daniel's presence in Denver for formal testimony. He arranged childcare through the neighbor with Bees, a woman who'd known about their situation through careful FBI briefing, and accepted Lily with grandmotherly warmth. The federal building loomed massive and imposing architecture, designed to communicate authority and permanence. Daniel navigated security with military ID that still carried weight despite years of civilian life, was escorted to conference rooms where prosecutors prepared their case. His testimony consumed hours, walking through events with precision that legal proceedings demanded. Every detail mattered, every timeline required verification, every choice needed justification. Daniel answered honestly, neither embellishing nor minimizing, presenting facts and allowing lawyers to construct narrative. During breaks, he glimpsed Mark in another room, visible through windows that separated witness from suspect. His former friend looked diminished, worn down by custody, in consequence, the confident soldier replaced by someone who understood the weight of choices that couldn't be unmade. Their eyes met briefly, recognition passing between them without communication. Mark nodded slightly, acknowledgement that carried apology and resignation in equal measure. Daniel returned the gesture, acceptance without forgiveness, understanding without absolution. The prosecutors were building their case methodically, stacking evidence like stones in cathedral construction. Kate's recordings provided foundation. The USB drive's contents supplemented by physical evidence, financial records, testimony from officers who chose cooperation over loyalty. Chief Morrison's detailed ledgers had proven prosecution's greatest asset, his meticulous record-keeping, documenting every transaction, every participant, every corrupt act across nearly a decade. The man's arrogance had created perfect roadmap for his own destruction. Daniel learned that Morrison was negotiating plea bargains, trying to reduce his inevitable sentence by providing information about officials higher in the corruption network. State senators, judges, administrators in positions that should have provided oversight, but instead offered protection. The cancer had metastasized further than even Kate had suspected, reaching into institutions that were supposed to serve as checks against exactly this kind of systemic failure. Exposing it meant destabilizing structures communities relied upon, creating chaos that would require years to resolve. That evening, driving back to collect Lily, Daniel felt the weight of unintended consequences. Kate's courage had been necessary, his assistance had been right, but the aftermath was creating suffering for people only peripherally involved. Officers' families facing poverty and shame, children bearing stigma of parental choices, communities losing faith in systems they needed to function. Justice was messy, Daniel reflected. Doing right didn't eliminate collateral damage. It just redirected it toward different victims. The officers who'd enabled drug trafficking had created countless casualties. Now their own families joined that casualty list, circular destruction that felt more like tragedy than triumph. Lily was helping the neighbor feed chickens when Daniel arrived, her laughter carrying across the yard like music. Seeing her happy, unburdened by the darkness Daniel carried provided perspective that courtroom testimony had obscured. Whatever complications the investigation created, Kate would have died without intervention, and that death would have allowed corruption to continue indefinitely. The mathematics weren't clean, but they favored action over inaction, courage over complicity. March arrived with gradual warming snow melting from lower elevations, while mountain peaks retained their white crowns. Daniel and Lily established routine that incorporated new awareness without surrendering to fear. They hiked, studied, maintained their life, while acknowledging it had been permanently altered by one night's choices. Lily was processing trauma in ways that surprised and concerned him. She'd begun drawing obsessively sketches that depicted the ranger station, the Storm Ranger attacking Mark. The images were surprisingly sophisticated for her age, capturing emotion and movement with intuitive artistry inherited from Maria. Daniel consulted with child psychologist Chen had recommended therapist who specialized in childhood trauma. Dr. Sarah Blackwell explained that Lily's drawings represented healthy processing, externalization of internal experience that allowed her to examine and integrate what had happened. The sessions with Dr. Blackwell took place weekly video calls that allowed Lily to receive professional support without traveling to distant offices. Daniel sat in on several learning vocabulary for discussing trauma, understanding developmental impacts of exposure to violence, gaining tools for supporting his daughter's recovery. One afternoon, Lily asked the question Daniel had been dreading. She wanted to know if what happened was her fault, if her scream had caused everything to escalate, if Ranger attacking Mark made her responsible for his injury. Daniel's response required careful construction, acknowledging her agency without burdening her with responsibility. He explained that she'd saved his life, that her scream had triggered Ranger's protective response at precisely the moment Daniel needed rescue. Her actions had been heroic, not shameful, appropriate response to witnessing her father being choked. But he also acknowledged that carrying such responsibility was heavy for someone so young that it was okay to feel complicated emotions about being brave. Heroes in storybooks made courage look simple, but real courage was messy, came with costs that persisted beyond immediate danger. Lily absorbed his words with typical seriousness, then asked whether Maria would be proud of them. The question landed with physical impact, stealing Daniel's breath momentarily. He gathered himself, answered with conviction that was both genuine and aspirational. Yes, Maria would be proud. Proud of Lily's courage, proud of Daniel's choices, proud that they'd stood up when standing was difficult. But Maria would also hurt seeing what they'd endured, would wish circumstances had been different, while understanding they'd done their best with impossible situation. April brought Kate's release from physical therapy, her recovery progressing faster than doctors had predicted. She testified multiple times, her composed courtroom presence, helping prosecutors secure convictions that might have faltered without her credible narration of events. Mark Evans had pled guilty to corruption charges in exchange for testimony against Morrison and others higher in the network. His sentence was 15 years federal, eligible for parole, and 7 with good behavior. He'd be 60 when he emerged, career destroyed, reputation permanently tarnished, but alive and possessed of opportunity for redemption, however limited. His daughter Emily had been placed in witness protection, her future salvaged, if not saved. The photographs that had been leveraged against Mark destroyed by federal order. She'd written her father a letter that Mark's lawyer had shared with Chen, who'd mentioned it to Daniel during the routine security check. The letter expressed love alongside anger, understanding alongside condemnation, the complex emotional mathematics of children processing parental failure. Emily would carry scars from her father's choices, but she was young enough to build life beyond them, resilient enough to integrate trauma without being defined by it. Daniel understood that particular hope, saw it reflected in Lily's gradual recovery, believed it because the alternative meant accepting that childhood trauma created permanent damage. The trials consumed Cedar Falls through spring media circus, eventually diminishing as newer scandals captured attention. The community was left to process betrayal in whatever ways communities manage such things, probably through selective memory and gradual forgiveness that prioritize social cohesion over accountability. Daniel and Lily visited Kate in Denver several times, watching her transition from patient to consultant, from victim to expert. The FBI had offered her position analyzing police corruption cases, traveling to departments facing similar issues, applying her experience to prevent what she'd exposed. The work seemed to energize her, providing purpose beyond personal recovery. She'd transformed trauma into expertise, suffering into service, creating meaning from circumstances that could have destroyed her. During one visit, Kate mentioned she'd been looking at properties, thinking about establishing base between assignments. Somewhere quiet, removed from urban complexity, near people she trusted. The subtext was obvious but unspoken possibility hanging in air without explicit acknowledgement. Lily responded with immediate enthusiasm, explaining that several cabins near theirs were available, that having Kate nearby would be wonderful, that Ranger missed her, and therefore obviously she should move closer. Her 7-year-old logic was transparent, motivated by affection that didn't recognize adult complications. Kate's eyes met Daniel's across the restaurant table, question implicit in her expression. His response came carefully acknowledging that having her as neighbor would be welcome, that Lily's enthusiasm reflected genuine sentiment. He shared that rebuilding after trauma sometimes meant accepting new connections rather than maintaining isolation. The conversation shifted to practical matters, but something had been established, possibility acknowledged, that would develop according to its own rhythm. Summer arrived with mountain glory meadows exploding in wildflower streams running high with snowmelt. Lily's 8th birthday was celebrated simply cake baked in their kitchen presence, focused on practical skills and creative supplies. Kate drove up from Denver bringing gift that made Lily shriek with delight. A professional art set supplies that treated her drawings as serious work rather than childish hobby. The gesture acknowledged who Lily was becoming, respected her processing of trauma through creation, validated her emerging identity as an artist alongside survivalist. That evening, after Lily had fallen asleep, surrounded by new colored pencils and sketch pads, Kate and Daniel sat on the porch watching sunset paint the mountains in impossible colors. Ranger lay between them, equally devoted to both. His loyalty expanded to include the woman who'd been integrated into their small pack. Kate's voice came quietly, barely audible above evening birdsong. She'd bought property 8 miles north cabin that needed substantial work but possessed good bones. She'd be moving in next month, planned to spend time between assignments, establishing base that felt like home rather than temporary shelter. Daniel felt something unlock in his chest, permission to imagine futures that included connections beyond the isolated life he'd constructed. Maria wouldn't have wanted him frozen in grief, wouldn't have expected permanent isolation. She'd have wanted Lily to see healthy relationships modeled, wanted Daniel to find companionship that honored their past without being imprisoned by it. His response acknowledged Kate's decision with warmth that stopped just short of presumption. Having her nearby would benefit everyone, her presence adding security and friendship and possibility. The mountains were vast enough for solitude when needed, but close enough for community when desired. They talked through darkness, conversation ranging across topics both significant and mundane. Plans for Kate's cabin renovation. Lily's continued homeschooling, the ongoing trials that were winding toward conclusion. Memories of the night that had connected their lives in ways none of them had chosen, but all had survived. Around midnight, Kate stood to leave her drive back to Denver, requiring alertness that fatigue threatened. Daniel walked her to the car, Ranger following with reluctant acceptance that she was departing temporarily rather than permanently. At her vehicle, Kate paused, turned to face Daniel directly. She thanked him again, though gratitude had been expressed countless times already. But this iteration carried different weight, acknowledgement that his choices had created possibility for futures neither of them could have imagined. Daniel accepted her thanks with equal weight, explaining that she'd given Lily something equally valuable. His daughter had watched adults stand up for principles, despite danger had witnessed courage under circumstances that justified a retreat, had learned that ordinary people could face extraordinary situations and choose rightly. Those lessons would shape who Lily became more profoundly than any curriculum Daniel could design. Kate had provided education that couldn't be taught, only demonstrated through lived experience. They stood in comfortable silence, autumn stars brilliant overhead mountain air, carrying pine scent and promise. Then Kate was in her car, taillights disappearing down the road that was becoming familiar to her, connection established that would develop however it developed. September brought Lily's return to what Daniel loosely termed formal education, though their approach remained unconventional. They'd been contacted by online academies specializing in gifted students program that would provide structure while accommodating their remote location and unusual circumstances. Lily approached the change with excitement mixed with nervousness, her social interaction having been limited to adults and the occasional child encountered during supply runs. Daniel worried about her adjustment, but understood that isolation couldn't continue indefinitely, that she needed peer interaction even if delivered through screens. The first days were rough. Lily struggling with communication styles different from family interaction with children who didn't share her experiences or interests. But gradually she found rhythm, discovered classmates who appreciated her observations, began forming friendships that existed primarily through pixels, but felt real nonetheless. Daniel watched her adapt with pride and melancholy, recognizing that growth meant incremental separation, that successful parenting produced independent humans who needed their parents less over time. Maria would have celebrated this development while feeling the same bittersweet recognition of childhood's temporary nature. October arrived with spectacular autumn display aspens turning gold against evergreen backdrop, air carrying crispness that promised winter's return. Kate had moved into her cabin, was spending weekends tackling renovation projects with determination that impressed Daniel when he visited to offer assistance. They worked well together. He discovered their communication efficient in ways that came from shared understanding of purpose and precision. Kate had vision for what her space should become. Daniel possessed skills to make vision reality collaboration producing results neither could have achieved alone. Lily helped when her studies allowed learning carpentry basics alongside continued medical training, adding practical construction skills to her expanding repertoire. She moved between both cabins with easy comfort, treating Kate's property as extension of their own territory relationship, evolving in ways that felt natural rather than forced. One Saturday, while installing new windows in Kate's living room, Lily asked the question that had apparently been building. She wanted to know if Kate was going to be her new mom, if that was why she'd moved nearby, if Daniel and Kate were going to get married like people did in her books. The directness was quintessentially Lily, her tendency toward frank inquiry, unchanged by trauma or time. Daniel and Kate exchanged glances, both recognizing that answer required honesty without creating expectations neither was ready to meet. Kate responded with careful truth, explaining that she cared deeply for both of them, but that relationships developed according to their own timing, that being neighbors and friends was wonderful without requiring additional labels. Sometimes adults built connections slowly taking time to understand what they meant to each other before defining it officially. Lily considered this explanation with typical seriousness, then announced that was fine, she just wanted to know what to tell people when they asked. The pragmatic concern was so perfectly childlike that both adults laughed, tension dissolving into shared amusement. November arrived with first significant snowfall, winter reclaiming territory it had surrendered months earlier. The anniversary of that night approached date that carried weight for everyone involved. Daniel felt it coming, like weather awareness building despite attempts to focus on present rather than past. Kate arrived the evening before the anniversary, ostensibly to help with firewood stacking, but really to mark the date together. They'd survived something that could have destroyed them, and acknowledging that survival felt important, even if difficult. After Lily went to bed, they sat by the fire ranger between them, silence comfortable enough that it didn't require filling. Eventually, Kate spoke, voicing thoughts that had apparently been developing. She explained that the year had taught her things she couldn't have learned otherwise. About courage requiring community, about justice demanding personal cost, about healing happening through connection rather than isolation. She'd spent her career believing individual excellence was sufficient, that being right mattered more than building alliances. But Daniel and Lily had shown her different model family unit that derived strength from interdependence rather than independence, that faced crisis through collaboration rather than solo heroism. That lesson had reshaped how she approached her work, her relationships, her understanding of what strength actually meant. Daniel absorbed her words, recognizing truth. He'd been learning through parallel process. He'd built isolation, believing it protected Lily from world's dangers. But that night had revealed that safety wasn't achievable through withdrawal. Connection provided protection, isolation couldn't, community offered resilience, individualism undermined. Maria had understood that he realized. Her insistence on raising Lily to believe in goodness wasn't naive optimism, but sophisticated recognition that humans were social creatures who needed each other to survive. Isolation was death by different names, slower but equally inevitable. His response emerged slowly, thoughts forming as he spoke. He thanked Kate for the gift she'd given them, not just survival but transformation, not just rescue but integration into larger world. They'd been hiding, he acknowledged, using isolation as shield against grief that needed processing rather than avoiding. The past year had been brutal but necessary, forced encounter with reality they'd been postponing. And having navigated it, having survived what had seemed unsurvivable, they'd emerged different people. Not better or worse necessarily, but more complete, more connected, more alive. Kate moved closer on the couch, her shoulder touching his warmth. That was comfort without demand. They sat that way through the fire's gradual dimming, watching flames reduce to embers, neither willing to break moment that felt sacred in ways that transcended romantic categories. Eventually, Kate stood to leave, though the hour was late, and the roads dark. Daniel walked her out, Ranger following with resigned acceptance of her departures. At her truck, she paused, turned to face him directly. She'd been thinking about Lily's question about relationships and labels and what they meant to each other. She didn't have answers yet, wasn't ready to define what they were building. But she wanted him to know she was thinking about it, that possibility existed even if timing remained uncertain. Daniel accepted her uncertainty without pressure, understanding that healing happened at different rates, that Kate's trauma was more recent and rawer than his own. He could wait, could accept friendship while remaining open to more, could build whatever they were building without demanding it conform to predetermined shape. Her kiss was brief, tentative question mark rather than declaration. Daniel returned it with equal uncertainty, aware of Lily possibly watching from window, aware of Maria's memory hovering like benediction rather than obstacle, aware that life was offering second chances in forms he hadn't anticipated. Then Kate was in her truck, driving through snow that had begun falling again, winter, asserting its claim on landscape they all shared. Daniel watched her taillights disappear, feeling something like hope mixed with appropriate caution, possibility, without presumption. Inside, Lily was pretending to be asleep, but smiled when Daniel checked on her. She asked if Kate had kissed him, matter-of-fact curiosity that expected honest response. Daniel confirmed the kiss with gentle firmness, explaining that adults sometimes developed romantic feelings, but that such things took time to understand fully. Right now, Kate was dear friend and trusted neighbor, and whether she became more was question for future rather than present. Lily announced that was acceptable. She just wanted to ensure everyone understood their roles clearly. Her organizational mind needed categorical clarity even when relationships resisted such definition. The concern was so endearingly Lily that Daniel kissed her forehead with gratitude for a child who continued surprising him with resilience and wisdom. December brought holidays that Daniel and Lily celebrated, simply traditions built around their family of 2+ Ranger. Kate joined them for Christmas, bringing gifts and laughter and presents that had become essential rather than optional. They ate dinner together, played board games, watched Lily's joy in ways that felt like honoring Maria rather than replacing her. Maria would have loved Kate, Daniel thought, not because Kate resembled her, but because Kate embodied qualities Maria valued: courage, integrity, commitment to justice, capacity for connection, despite trauma. His wife would have wanted this for him, would have chosen Kate herself if given opportunity to select Daniel's future companion. That night after Kate had departed and Lily slept, Daniel looked at photos of Maria's annual ritual that marked holidays and anniversaries. She smiled from frames and albums, frozen at 31, forever young, while everyone else aged. He told her about the year, about Kate and Lily's growth, and his own stumbling toward healing. He promised to continue raising their daughter with courage Maria had demanded, to build life that honored her memory without being imprisoned by it. And he thanked her wherever consciousness persisted after death, for choosing him, for giving him Lily, for teaching him that love was worth all risks, including devastating loss. January arrived with brutal cold and clarity, New Year symbolizing transformation they had undergone. The trials had concluded, sentences handed down, Cedar Falls beginning process of rebuilding trust in institutions that had betrayed it. The work would take generation, but at least it had begun. Daniel received letter from Mark, written from federal prison, carried weight of confession and attempted redemption. His former friend explained what imprisonment was teaching him, how time and consequence had clarified thinking that corruption had clouded. He apologized again, knowing apologies couldn't undo harm, couldn't restore what had been taken from Emily or the community or himself. But he wanted Daniel to know that their friendship had been real, despite how it ended, that the man who'd saved Daniel in Afghanistan and the man who'd threatened his family were same person at different points in moral journey. The letter concluded with requests that Daniel not respond, that he simply accept Mark's acknowledgement without feeling obligated to forgive. Some wounds couldn't be healed through communication. Some breaches demanded distance rather than reconciliation. Daniel read the letter several times, feeling complex emotions that resisted simple categorization. He couldn't forgive what Mark had done, but understood how Mark had arrived there. He couldn't restore friendship, but could acknowledge its former authenticity. He couldn't erase the past, but could accept its complexity without demanding it conform to clear moral categories. Finally, he filed the letter in the trunk with Maria's belongings repository for painful pieces of past that required preservation without constant examination. Then he returned to present, to Lily practicing piano in the living room, to Kate arriving for dinner she'd promised to cook, to life that was continuing, despite everything that had tried to stop it. They'd survived winter's storm, literal and metaphorical. They'd emerged different but intact, wounded, but healing, separated by loss, but connected through choice. The future remained uncertain, but uncertainty felt less threatening when faced together. Outside snow began falling again, as it would continue falling through mountain winters, counting forward into futures none of them could predict. But inside the cabin, warmth and light and laughter, small family built from trauma and choice, and stubborn refusal to surrender to circumstances that had seemed overwhelming. And that Daniel thought pulling Lily close while Kate smiled from the kitchen was enough. More than enough.